Hello, Lee Halliday here, and today we are going to look at MobX State Tree. I've done a video before on MobX and I love it, and then sort of discovered MobX State Tree recently and wanted to see what it's all about. So I spent the last week or so looking into it, and now I'm going to basically share what I learned and how it compares to MobX. So what we're going to be doing is building a little invoicing application. Finance, pretty much the most boring thing you can look at, but let's get started. So we've got a Create React app that's pretty much empty. And let me give you a quick overview of what it looks like. We've got our index that renders an app to the root. And we've got our app component, which simply renders a div. So nothing's going on here, right? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to exit out of this. We're going to add 3 packages. So we're going to add MobX. Even in MobX State Tree, this is still used. We're also going to use MobX React like before, but now we're going to add in MobX State Tree to the picture as well. Oh geez. Welcome to my life. Okay. Well, this is installing. It won't take too long. Then we can start up our React app again. And let's get going. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is basically build what we used to call our store, and now I'm going to refer to as a model. So in MobX State Tree, you can have models that are sort of all nested together, and what you're going to see is it ends up looking a lot like prop types in React. So we're going to create a first one called our invoice, which is going to be the top level model that we're dealing with, sort of that contains all of the sub models for our invoicing store. So what we're going to do is import something called types from MobX State Tree, and then we're going to start building our invoice. So what we're going to have is our const, we'll say invoice, and it's types.model. So we're defining our first model, and we're going to give this one the name of an invoice. And here's where you're going to see where it starts to look a lot like prop types in React. This is where we define all of the fields that are going to be in our model. And if you're used to MobX, this is where you would have your observable properties. So for our invoice, we're going to say that we have a currency, which will be a types.string. We're going to have an isPaid property, which will be a Boolean. And one little trick is if you want it to have like a default value for Booleans, I'm sure numbers and strings are the same. And it's sort of optional. If you don't provide it, it's, let's say in this case, an invoice is false by default. You can actually just say false here, and MobX State Tree will figure it out. Next up, you know what, let's stop here. Cool. So now we want to start to use our invoice inside of our app. So what I'm going to do is go back to the root of this thing, and I'm going to create a new instance of our invoice model. So we'll say invoice, we've got to import it. So import invoice from models invoice. That's right. Oh, shoot, what did it do? Okay. Const invoice equals, so we're going to take our invoice model and we are going to create a new instance of it. So here's where we can pass in the initial sort of state of what our model's data looks like. So here we can say that our currency is going to be CAD because I'm in Canada. And we don't have to say isPaid false because we basically set it up, if you remember, that its default value will be false. So we can take that out. All right, so now we have our invoice, and let's pass that into our app. Cool. So if we come here Oh, that's because we're in components. So it's not dot dot. No, we're not in components. We're here in the main source, so it's not dot dot slash. Okay, excellent. So the error we got was there's no default that was exported, which makes sense because I never exported it. There we go. So nothing is really going on. And I'm actually going to switch to my main Chrome. I was looking up the weather today because I have some dev tools here and I didn't in my incognito. So we can go into React and we can see that our app component receives an invoice, and it actually nicely shows you your properties here. And you can see that the currency is CAD and it is paid is false. Okay, so if we come here, right now this component is receiving invoice as a prop. So what we'll do is we'll just extract it from our props. And what we want to do is basically come in here and we want to show whether the invoice is paid or not. So we can embed in here and we can say something like, if the invoice is paid, paid, not paid, like that. So just do a ternary here, so it's not paid right now. So we're going to look into our first little bit of what you can do with MobX State Tree. So if anytime you're sort of doing logic on your data or a calculation or things like that, sort of extracting something, in this case a string from our data, we can use what's called a view. And in MobX terms, that was called a computed property. So we're going to views. And what you do with this is you pass it an arrow function that receives self. And because I want to return back an object, I'm just going to put this so I don't have to say return. And then what I'm going to return is an object. So in here now, we've got our little arrow function receiving self, which refers to the instance of the model. And now we want to return an object, and our object is going to have a little function that helps us display the status of the invoice. So we'll call it status, and it will simply return paid or not paid. Like that, save and prettier does its thing. So now we can go back to our component and we can call status on our invoice and we get the same thing. So anytime you sort of want to do a calculation or compute something from the data in your model, you can use views for that. And that was the same as computed properties in MobX. All right, so we want to be able to then change the status of this invoice from not paid to paid. So we are going to add a button here. And right now it will just say pay. So we need a way for this button to change the isPaid property from false to true. And the way we're going to do that is with something called an action. And actions also existed in regular old MobX. So we're going to say dot actions. Okay, so actions also receives an arrow function that will have self, and we want to return an object, so we do that. And then we can put our functions in here that are for our actions. So we're going to have an action called mark paid. And this will take our isPaid property and set it to true, like that. All right, I've messed up something. That closes that, that closes that, that closes that. Oh, double dot. There we go. All right, So we've created our action. So what are actions? Actions are anything which modifies the data inside of your model. Okay, so now we want to make our button call the mark paid action. So we add an on click, and we can just simply say invoice.markPaid, and it will call it when it's clicked. Because we're not going to do anything with like event and preventing default and all that, we can actually just pass this in. Alternatively, you could do like an arrow function that receives E, and in here like prevent default, and then invoice.markPaid. So that works too, but we don't need that, so I'm just going to delete all that again and say that it calls the markPaid function when it's clicked. So we click this, nothing happens. Why? Well, this is still false, and the reason is because we haven't told this component to observe changes to our model. So what we can do is import an observe function from MobX React, and this is the same one that we were using before in regular MobX. And this is where if you had decorators you could say that we observe here, but I didn't set that up, so what we can just do is call observe at the end to make our component, our app component, into one that observes changes. Oh, what is it? Observer? There we go. So we click this, and now it is watching this. So let's just clean this up a bit. We don't want to show, we only want to show the button pay when it is not paid. So we can say invoice dot is paid, not is paid, and that. That work? Boom, and it's gone. Sweet. All right, so moving on. We've now showing the status, which introduced what views are. We used our markPaid action function to change one of the properties. And now we're going to look at how we can have sub models that we use. So we're going to create a new model. We're going to call this the invoice items. No, call it the item list model. So same thing, we're going to want types from MobX State Tree. And then we are going to create our item list. So we've got item list is types.model, and we'll give it a name and then describe what our data looks like. So our data in the item list is going to have a bunch of items which are types.array. So that's what it's going to look like, and eventually we'll add some actions to it. And I know I'm forgetting something, but we'll keep going, we'll figure it out later. Export default item list. Okay. So now we want to basically put our item list model into the invoice. So what we can do is we can say, first of all, we're going to import it. So import item list from item list. And we're going to add a new property called our item list, and it's going to be our item list. So we load this, it fails. Functions are not supported as properties, use views instead. All right. Luckily I have a copy so I can figure out what I did wrong because I already got this working once before. Bear with me. As I said, I'm new to this, so I'm also figuring this out and doing this video as a way to teach. All right, so we got that, which is going to be an array of items. Over here in invoice, okay, so we have an optional item list, which looks like this at the beginning. All right, forget that happened. So we have types.optional because we may not have an item list at the beginning, so we can basically give it a default value. And it is going to be an item list, which looks like an object that has an array of items. Cool. Let's go back to our view, refresh it, and it again doesn't work. And that is because in our item list we said we're going to have an array, but we need to tell it an array of what. So what we're going to be putting in here is an array of items, but we haven't created items yet, so let's go do that now. So we import types from MobX State Tree, and then we create our item, which is a model. Oops, there we go. All right, and we need to describe what our item looks like. So each of our items is going to have a quantity, which will be a number. We are going to have a price, which will also be a number. And we're going to have a name, which will be a string. So we need to remember to export this thing. So now we've got an item model, which goes inside of our item list, which is has an items, which is an array of item. And all right, it's working again. So we look at our invoice model now. It now looks like currency, we got our is paid, and we now have an item list. And what the item list has is an array of items inside of it. So we need a way to add a new item to our invoice. So we're going to do that with a form. So we'll go back here and we'll put a form. Okay, oh freak. Form, don't hit save because Prettier will close it for you. And what we're going to do is first we're actually just going to start putting the things inside of it. We'll build one first and then just start copying and pasting them. So we're going to have a label, and what this will be the name of our item. And then we'll have an input in here, which will be text. And what we need to do is give this a ref so that we can access its data later. So ref receives an input, and then we'll say this is the name input, like that. And I guess we could give it an ID as well of name so that we can put name here. All right, let's there, and now we have our name field. So now I'm going to copy and paste this a couple times. So we'll do quantity second. What is there? Is there a number now in HTML5? Forget. So we got our quantity input, and then we've got our price input. Might have to change this, I forget. All right, see if that works. Yeah, it gives you this little up and down thing. Cool. So now we have our three inputs, and we need a button to submit this thing. So we'll do a button, which is type submit, and we'll say that this adds these items to our store. So you've got this little form here. Okay, so what we need to do now is handle what happens when you actually submit this form. And what we're going to do is we're going to add an onSubmit here. And this time we will do a full arrow function so that we can prevent the default. And what we want to do is grab all of these values from here and then pass them over to our invoice item list, which we're going to build an add action to. So we've got actions, and if you remember, it's an arrow function that receives self, which returns an object, and we will give it an add function. So this is going to receive an item, and what it's going to do is simply access the items and push it on, like that. So unlike like with Redux, MobX handles a lot of the complexity of creating immutable data structures, so we don't need to take a copy of our old items and then add a new one to it. We can just push it on, and MobX will handle all of that for us. And now that we have this add action, we can use it. So we'll come back here. So we're going to access our invoice again, but remember, invoice isn't what has the add action, it's the item list. So because item list is a property of the invoice, we can access that, and it's the one that has the add function. Okay, so what we need to pass to it is an object that has all of the properties needed to create an item. Remember what items are? We've got quantity, price, and name. And I'll do it with a mistake first. I know this mistake will happen, and then we'll figure out how to fix it. So we've got our name, which is the name input.value. We've got our quantity, which is the quantity input.value. And we've got our price, which is the price input.value. And we'll just make it a little bit nicer. We will reset the form when it's done, and then we'll set the focus on the first one so that we can easily add more. Oh, no, the target is the reset, not the event, which is the target in this case is the form. Okay, we'll go to console. So we'll say we're going to add some T, one of them for $1.50. Oh, geez. All right. I don't know what the proper one is, so we're just going to use text for this. T, $1.50. And big air. So the reason is because in forms, everything is a string, even though we said that this one is specifically a number input. When you grab the value of it, it's a string. So we just need to take this string value of 1 and convert it into a number. So we'll come up here and we'll just wrap a parse int around this. It's a base 10 integer. And then we'll do the same for here. So this is a parse float, and you don't need to say anything for float. So now we can add 1T for $1.50, and it resets the form and resets the focus onto the name. And we have no idea if it's actually added an item to our store or not. So I'm going to introduce two tools now that help you debug MobX. And the first tool is built into MobX itself. So we're going to come here and we are going to import something. Can't remember what it's called, so I've got this here. So it's a function called onPatch, which comes from MobX State Tree. So we go, where's that? To our index, and we are going to import the onPatch function from MobX State Tree. So what onPatch does is you pass an arrow function to it, which receives the patch, and then you can do anything you want to it. So we are simply going to log it to the console. Oh, and I actually think you have to, I think it receives the invoice first. and then what you do with the patch. I don't know, I forget. Let's see if it works. So when I click this, there we go. So what onPatch does is it basically gets called every time a change is made to the data in your model. And this patch argument that we're receiving here contains all the data about the change. So the operation was that we replaced the isPaid property with true. And we can then say that we're going to add some T, $1.50. And now you can see that there was an add operation. And then what was the path of the change? So remember that it's a state tree. And now you can see that the path and the tree, it's modeled in the way of a tree. So we have our item list, which has an array of items, and we are adding one to the 0th or the first one, which has this value here. So this is a way you can tie in here. You could make changes like post them to the back end whenever you see changes made here. I'm just going to use it for debugging, but I'm going to show a second way to debug as well. Go back to my trusty README. So I want this MobX DevTools MST package. Okay. Yarn add there. Was it save dev or dev? I don't know, can't remember. Okay, so what this does is it helps you look at all of the changes inside of some dev tools. Start up Yarn again, and I need to call make inspectable. First I need to import it. Where's this thing? Here. Okay, so I'm going to make inspectable the invoice. Just like that. And now I can open up my inspector tools and I can click into MST. So here we're looking at our MobX State Tree data. So here's the initial value, which is a CAD, false, an item list which has an array of nothing yet. We'll mark it as paid. You can see that this change was made. It shows you the same patch information here, and it shows you the updated state. We can add T, and it shows you the same information here. You can also see the views over here as the changes that are that are happening as you call actions, and you can also see some performance actions or performance indications as well. So if we say let's add coffee 2 for $2, didn't show anything, but I have seen it working in the past. So this is cool to see what's going on inside of your app. I'm going to leave this in the console as well just to have both running. Okay, so now that we've got the ability to add items to our store, let's display them. So I'm going to create a new component for this, and we'll just call it the item component. So I'm going to import React from React. And that's it for now. Let's start using it first, and then we'll come back to what this will look like. So we go to our app, and below the form, I'm going to loop through and show all of the different items. And we're going to put them inside of a UL. So we can access our invoice dot, what's it called? Item list. And then we've got our items. And then we're going to map them. So we'll just say here that we receive the item and its index. And what we want to show for each one is our new item component, which we're building. And we're going to pass the item onto it. And you got to add a key, otherwise it will complain. Cool. So it's going to complain because item it's not defined yet. So let's go import it. All right, and I hadn't exported anything yet, so it's complaining. So let's go do that. Okay, so instead of building a full-on component, we'll just do an arrow function here, and we are going to export default our arrow function. And what we're going to receive, you always receive the props here when you're doing arrow functions. You know what I mean? But we can extract right away the item from those props so that we can just use that. And in here we're going to have our li that shows each item. So in here we can show the item.name, how many quantity you bought, and then the price. So quantity is that, and the price is like that. So T, $1, T, quantity of 1, price of 1. Okay. So let's make this look a little bit nicer. So we've got our quantity, we'll put a colon there. Say we've got quantity times price. If we want to make this show up with a $sign, we can just throw that $sign there. And then, what is it, to fixed? So that it formats it nicely. So T1, 1, there we go. 1 times $1. And let's say that we want to show the total now. So equals a total of some sort. Here's where we can go and use those views that we have access to. So this is on our item. We'll add a views to it, which receives self. We're going to return an object that gets the total. So we can return the quantity times the price, not this, self.price. So now we can go back out here to our component and call the total. So we can put a $sign not because we need to embed, but just because we actually want a $sign. We'll call the total, and then we'll format it with fixed as well. Don't worry about it putting on multiple lines. That's just prettier formatting things. So again, T, and let's say we want 5 coffees, and it's multiplying here and showing it nicely. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now let's add a bit more functionality. Let's add the ability to increment and decrement the quantity of each of these items. So anytime you want to change the data, you're talking about actions. So we need to add actions, which as always receives an arrow function, and we're going to return an object, and we're going to have increment function, which takes our quantity and adds 1 to it, and we'll have a decrement action as well, which does the opposite. Just like that. So now we need to call these and create buttons for them. So we go back out to our item, and we're going to add a button here with a minus sign. And we'll say when you click this button, we want to call the increment function. Nope, that would be the decrement. And then we'll do another one for increment, like so. So T1, 1, now we can, and nothing's changing. But you can see that the data is changing. And again, this is this observable thing. Or not observable, but observer. All right, what are we going to do here? Let's put this into a variable. and then let's export default observer item. Import observer from MobX React. See if that fixed it. There we go. So now it's actually observing changes. We can increment and decrement. And obviously there's no like validation, so you can have -3t's, which doesn't make sense, but just go with it. Okay, so we're gonna add a little bit more functionality and then we're done. We're gonna have the ability to remove one of these, and we're also gonna add one more thing to show the total of everything you've added to your invoice. So let's do the remove first. It's actually a bit tricky. So we're gonna have a new button which will call a remove action that we haven't created yet. We'll just put an X as the icon for that. Oops. Okay, so we need to go into our item and add a remove action. All right, so the weird thing is here is that we can't really remove ourselves. Where each item lives is actually in the item list, right? So instead, we need to use something called getParent. And I may have to look this up again because it's still a little bit fuzzy for me. Oh, no, we can just do getParent. It comes from the same place. Because this is a tree, we can walk up the tree. So if we're at item, we want to go to our parent called item list. So what we can do is we can call getParent, and I think we want the parent of ourself. And if you go up one level, you're just at the items array. So, because see, we're inside of this array. So if you go up one level, you're here. We want to go up another level to go to the actual item list. So you could call getParent twice, or there's this handy thing that you can just say, basically step up 2 levels. So one level to go to the items array, another level to go to the item list. And then we can say that we want to remove ourselves. And this won't do anything yet because our item list doesn't yet have a remove action, so we need to go and create it. So we come over here, we have add already, so we're gonna remove an item as well. And so now we've got this item and we need to remove it from this array. So we can use splice for that. So we'll access our items and we'll say that we want to splice it, and we want to splice it at the index of the item that we're being passed. We want to remove one item. So splice basically goes to wherever this thing is, say it's at index 0, and it removes one item, and you're left with the end result of removing that one item from the array. Let's make sure I'm not lying to you. So we got 2 of these for $10. Remove it, and it works. Great, and you can see that it's our MobX State Tree is telling us that here we had a remove operation. So MobX State Tree is smart enough to know, okay, when you splice, you're removing an item from array, so we're going to use the remove operation at this path. And if we come over here, we can see what our data looks like before it was removed. So we had our one item in here of T, and after we have an empty array. All right, so we've got our last piece that we're going to look at. And that would be, you know what, I'm just going to remove this $sign here. Maybe, because I wanted it showing up on one line. There. Beautiful, beautiful. All right. So the last thing we're going to do is just show a total for all the items that we have in our invoice. So if we had coffee for $1 here, I just want to show a total of $5 here. We're going to use views for that. So where would you put that? Not on your item because we want to get the total of all the items. You could put it on your invoice, but I say let's just add it to our item list because this is where all the items live. So we need to add a views, which receives that and returns an object. And we're going to have a total function. Okay, so we need to calculate the total, and what we're going to do is return, and we need to get the total of all of our items. So we're actually going to use reduce, and we're going to access our items and then reduce them. And what reduce does is it takes an arrow function and a default value. So because we're starting at 0 and then we're going to count the total of all of them, we can do that. All right, I always forget the order of these two things, so we'll give it a try and see if it works. So the arrow function that you pass to your reduce, it takes an accumulator, we'll call it the sum, and that's sort of as you're looping through and you're keeping track of each one, what's the total sum at that point, and then your item as you're looping through your items. And instead of doing return, since you always want to return the new value, we can just say that we want the sum plus the item total, like that. So now, whenever we call total here, we'll reduce the items and get the total of each of them. And remember, total was a view that we added to each of the items, which returned just quantity times price. So we go back here, and we'll stick this thing right between them, and we'll say that it's an H2. And it's going to say total is $, just because we want it, and it is the invoice.itemlist.total. And then we'll format it fixed. Okay, so we've got a total of 0. We can add T for $10. Let's make this big. Tea for $10. Coffee for $2. And yerba mate for, oh, very expensive, 20 bucks. And we can add quantity, remove quantity, and everything is calculating very nicely here. So that's it. I'll just give a quick overview and then we're done. So today, obviously, we looked at MobX State Tree and how it compares to MobX. Once we added the packages, we started creating our models. And we started top level with an invoice, which has a few fields. The most interesting field is the item list, which is optionally, it will be an item list. And this is what its default value looks like. It added some actions. Actions change the data. And it also had views, which allow you to perform calculations from your data. So this had an item list, which is over here. Item list had an array of items, which we said it's an array of item. It had a couple actions as well. The ability to add and remove items. And then we had a little total function here, which looped through our items and calculated the total for all of them. So if we go over to item, this is sort of the bottom of our tree. We had quantity, price, and name. And then we had the ability to increment the quantity, decrement it, and remove. Remember, remove was the trickiest because we had to walk 2 levels up our state tree, 2 parents higher, and call its remove function, passing in ourself. And then we had a little view here to calculate the total for this item. And that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed the video and have a great day. Take care. Bye.